So I am going to do my best to get us back on track time-wise because I do not want to stand between you guys and lunch, especially to make you guys listen to me talk about numbers, research, and statistics. All right, I can read a room. I know that's probably not going to, delay your hunger pains. So, as Jonathan said, I'm Ann Mahar, and I did most of the data analysis component to what Barb presented. So, as Barb mentioned, there was not a lot of research done evaluating the Michigan sentencing guidelines before, our project. There were 4 major research things, and we used those as a starting point of what we were going to build on. And these are some of the things that are unique contributions of what we did. So first, and arguably what I'm going to say is probably one of the most important, is the offense breakdown. So a lot of prior research looked at all A-grade offenses together. And then, kind of made comparisons. And we'll talk about in our regression analyses how looking at all of them together masks a lot of important differences when we break them down by specific offense. Thanks, Josh. We have a much larger sample size. We dove into, and as Barb talked about a little bit, we examined every single PRV and OV and how many people have that, how that impacts sentences. I will not go over all of those things, but they are in there. County level analyses, we looked at 13 specific counties, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And we also did a deeper dive into what sentences were habitualized and the impact of that habitualization. So in order to do this research, we had a lot of data. So there was 2 data sets covering 3 guidelines periods. We looked at the 4 most common life max offenses, as Barb had mentioned. So second-degree murder, assault with intent to commit murder, first-degree CSC, and armed robbery. And we looked at 13 specific counties. So the 13 counties that were chosen for the research were the 13 counties that had the largest number of commitments for assault offenses in 2013. Because if you'll remember, our data collection ended at 2012. So another thing that's kind of unique about our research is that unit of analysis is the sentence, not an individual. So there are individuals are represented in our data multiple times because we looked at sentence as our unit of analysis. We only included sentences that had a minimum and maximum term. So we removed the life with parole sentences for most of our data analysis because it's difficult to kind of quantify those in the same way that we can with sentences that have minimums and maximums. The other thing that we did was remove redundant sentences. So if someone had the exact same sentence for the exact same offense in the same county on the same day, that was excluded. But any of those things change, they would be included. So if it's the exact same offense, 2 different counties, both of those sentences are included in our data. So same statutory citation, all of those things. So we removed the redundant sentences in order to not artificially skew our results. Next one. Okay. Good. So for methods of analysis, we did a lot of different things. Most of what I'm going to be talking about is our multivariate analyses, so our multiple regression, so the kind of more advanced statistic components. Barb mentioned some of our univariate analysis, so our ideas of using the median, right? So there's reasons we use the median. Essentially, most of the Michigan sentencing data is skewed. So as you can see in the image, we went with the median of 8 because, that's where most of the data is. But the mean is 10.3 because we have those outlier cases all the way out there at 60 years, right? So that is making sentences look like they're longer than is necessarily true for the vast majority. So, skewed average. So, as Barb kind of mentioned, we use the medians as kind of a guidepost so then we could make comparisons between different counties, the different offenses and sentence length, but it is not always, right? Don't take it as everyone who has this offense is serving this sentence, right? We're just kind of using it as a guidepost for comparisons. So in cleaning the data, so primarily taking out those redundant sentences and the life with parole sentences, we found a couple of things, right before we get into like our real findings. So the number of sentences per defendant increased over time. So this varied a lot by offense, county, and habitual status. So among the sentences, totally just lost where I was. Among the sentences without habitual offender enhancements, only 81% had only one sentence during the second judicial period, and that moved down to 74% under the legislative guidelines. So as we move these guideline periods, we see multiple sentences becoming more of a practice and more common. This is even more so true for habituals, and depending on what offense someone is being sentenced for, CSC offenses are the most common to have multiple sentences for the same offense. This also varied by county, but I will get to counties at the end in interest of not giving you entirely too much information on every single slide. So the other thing that we kind of discovered and wanted to at least note is that the number of parolable life sentences has declined as the number of long indeterminates or LID sentences has increased. So in 1993, we saw a peak in the parolable life sentences imposed, and then after between 2007 and 2012, the number is never more than 17. So we saw a really stark decrease in the number of life with parole sentences. So this is a really ugly chart, and it's for a reason. Okay, so what explains sentence length? Short answer is a whole lot of stuff, and not of it, all of it is great or perfect, right? But we're going to break it down. So we did regression analyses, focusing on two primary functions. So first, in a regression analysis, you can identify how much a specific independent variable explains in the variance. So for us, sentence length. And the other thing that we used regression analyses for is to estimate how large of an impact that is. So Barb and I talked a lot about regression analyses, and the way that I always feel like it's best explained is from baking a cake, right? So when you bake a cake, you only put in a pinch of salt, right? So it makes up very, very small amount of the total ingredients. But if you miss that salt, you're going to notice, right? Your cake is not going to taste the same. So it makes up a very small amount of the ingredients, but it has a really big impact on the flavor. No bakers? Okay. So if we look at our four main guidelines factors, ideally what is going to explain the most of our sentencing variation, we explain 70.9%. So if we look at just what offense was committed, the prior record score, the offense score, and the habitual status, we explain over 70% of our variation in sentence length. So like I said, we did multiple different kinds of analyses in order to break this down in different ways. So overall, looking at second-degree murder, assault with intent, CSC, and armed robbery, we explain 70%. But when we break those down into separate offenses, that change is pretty big. So our four guidelines factors only explains 29% of the variation in murder sentences, up to almost 70% of armed robbery sentences. So when we look at, right, all of the sentences together, it looks, right, like we're doing pretty good. But then when we break it down by offense, we can see in more detail that things aren't adding up quite probably as we would hope. So in looking at all of the offenses together, the most important factor is what offense was committed, explaining over a quarter of sentence variation. So this makes sense, right? M2 has its own grid, obviously, right? Calculated on a separate grid to reflect the unique seriousness of the crime. And these sentences are always by far the longest. Armed robbery is consistently viewed as the least serious of the 4 crimes that we examined, and consistently, right, these sentences are much lower for those offenses. So, obviously, we can't break that down by offense because that's already taken into account when we do the offense breakdown. But this suggests 2 things. So murder is inherently different, and is evidenced by, right, having its own grid and, right, sentences being so much longer on that grid. Offense variable. I really thought I fixed that. My bad, guys. So offense variable. Right, so your OV score explains about 20% when looking at the entire, right, offenses together. This differs greatly by what offense. So the offense severity only explains about 5% of the differences we see in murder sentences, and about 29% for the other 3 offenses. So having much more importance in our A-grade offenses and, right, second-degree murder, kind of in a league of its own, not being explained very much by the severity of the offense. The fact that it was a second-degree murder is really what's driving that sentence length there. So breaking down these offenses allow us to examine some specific differences that are overshadowed in the full model, right? So the fact that if we look at it all together, it looks like 20%, but really it's explaining a very small amount in M2 sentences. So prior record variable, pretty close, right? So OV was 19%, PRV 23%, right? And Barb mentioned that idea of keeping prior record and offense severity. Barb, you're looking at me like no. Keeping them, right, kind of balanced, right? The importance of having them be equal to each other. So in the full model, we see that kind of working out and them having a similar explanatory power in the regression analyses. So the extent to the variance, of course, explained by prior record variable ranged again. So it explained 20% of variance in murder sentences, but almost 36% of the difference we see in armed robbery sentences. So being much more important in armed robbery than in the other offenses. Habitual status, arguably, is the salt of the cake batter, right? So it looks like not very much is explained here, only 2.6%. However, when looking at individual sentences, habitual status does have a very large impact. The other thing to note about the impact of habitual status is that it had to kind of do with the order that we put our ingredients in our regression because it's so highly correlated with prior record variable. Like Barb mentioned, a lot of the things in prior record variable are also counted in habitual status. So if we rearranged it, so we looked at habitual status first before we looked at prior record variable, it would actually explain 15% of the variance, and it would take away from how much prior record explains. All that to say that habitual status is important, even if in this graphic it doesn't look as important. So taking these, right, guideline factors together, we're at that 70.9%, and, right, the guidelines were supposed to explain all of the sentence length. So we still got 30% out there that is not explained by the guidelines factors. Departures, as Barb had mentioned, are a very large and important factor in sentence lengths for Michigan. So departures, which are essentially a rejection of the guidelines, play a critical role. So explaining almost 18% in sentence length, looking at all of them together. brings our cumulative to almost 90%, which in the social science world, if you can explain 90% of something, that is like such a huge win. But for sentencing guidelines, not so much, right? We want to explain all of the variation we see in sentence length, and we still got 10% hanging out that we can't explain. Departures, when we look at the offenses broken down, they play a much larger role in second-degree murder. So in second-degree murder, departures explain over 50% of the variance we see in sentence lengths. So, right, putting all of these together, we're kind of masking that idea. As where for the other offenses, for CSC, it explains 30% of the variance. In armed robbery, 26%, and assault, 20%. So when we examine the variance, this is why I don't actually make notes, because then I read them and then I forget what I'm saying. So I'm going to keep going with what I usually do. Okay, so, sorry. Systemic factors. So these are the factors that are always going to kind of be involved in the process and system of sentencing, but theoretically don't necessarily have a huge role. So conviction method, explaining less than 0.5%. County of conviction, less than 0.1%. But these are similar to the idea of habitual status, that in this picture they don't look like they make a very big difference. However, when we start looking at the sides of the impact of these different variables, county of conviction, and especially conviction method, can have very large impacts on the sentences that people actually end up receiving. Barb also did a little bit of research on sentencing judge. We didn't have enough data on sentencing judge to include that in the regression analyses, but essentially one of the main things that we found is that judges in the very same county impose significantly different sentences for the same offense type. So in the county, same bench, same offense, very different sentences depending on if you were in courtroom A or courtroom B and who your judge was that day. Defendant characteristics wasn't even statistically significant in most of our analyses, which is a good thing, right? Those should not be impacting our sentence length. So what we found was that women generally received shorter sentences. They made up a relatively small portion of our population. So women accounted for almost 11% of murder sentences, but less than 5% for every other kind of offense. Women's sentences were always shorter, and this is largely due to women having much lower prior records than their male counterparts and having a higher proportion of guilty pleas. Age, generally, as one might expect, we saw sentence length increase with age, right? As you are older, you have more time to kind of accumulate that prior record. The exception to this is consistently we found that juveniles under 17 who had been waived into the jurisdiction of adult court received longer sentences than youth who were just 17 and had to be in the adult court. So there was a difference in those prior records of those juveniles. So as Barb kind of had mentioned, race plays a really complex role when looking at sentencing. It's not separately, it does not play a significant portion or explain a significant portion in sentencing length. However, it has a lot of indirect kind of relationships, right? So specifically, we looked at prior record, and also worth noting that our sample was very skewed to non-white. So non-whites comprised 74% of our sample, right, for these 4 offenses in this time period. And, right, the non-whites are overrepresented for each offense, except for CSCs, which non-whites comprised only 44% of our population. So when we look at sentence length, we generally see that those who are non-white do have longer sentences, but right? It is explained by other factors. It is not race per se at the sentencing stage. It's all those kind of earlier decisions that were made specifically related to prior record. So, the impact of these factors on sentence length. So we know how much of the sentence they explain, but right, this part is how much of an impact does it actually have. So this is the other part of regression analyses where we can estimate how our baseline sentences will change if particular variables are adjusted. And there's quite a few tables that are pretty involved if you feel so possessed to go and kind of like do the math of how long sentences would be. There is kind of like one breakdown example in there. But if you have questions, I'm more than happy to talk about that. So that was the other kind of major thing that we looked at, is how these different factors impact sentence length. So in the full model, an increase from PRV level A to PRV level C was associated with an estimated increase of 73% in sentence length. So, right, goes up about 3/4 just from level A to level C. PRV level had the least impact in M2 sentences. Then, right, in OV level, we see something kind of similar, that from OV level 1 to OV level 3, we see a 78% increase. And then, right, when we look at the lowest level, moving up to the highest level, we see the sentences increase almost, right, 3 times. OV level had the most impact on sentences for CSC offenses. Again, in the full model, looking at departures, if a sentence was a downward departure, instead of being within the guidelines range, we estimated a 44% decrease in sentence length, and right, looking at increase or upward departures, we saw a 76% increase in sentence length. This again varied with what offense we were looking at. So the lowest decrease was 43% for downward departures for robbery sentences, and an 82% increase for upward departures, specifically for CSC offenses. So, conviction method. We could probably do a whole presentation on conviction method alone, but I will not do that to you. But essentially, our big takeaway is that the guidelines reinforce disparities that are created by plea bargaining. So, in the graph, we can see that second-degree murder. The first column is the median sentence if someone were to plea. The second column is if they were to go to a bench trial, and the third column is the median sentence if they go to a jury trial. And then there's the percent increase, which is often called the trial tax. There's plenty of debate on if the trial tax is a tax or if pleading you get a benefit, but essentially the real takeaway here is people are getting very different sentences for the exact same offense. Same PRV, same OV, right? Same facts, but depending on if they're going to jury or going to a jury trial or plea, right? They're getting very different sentences. This had a significant impact on our life max offenses and what sentences they received. But it kind of, I think, an important note. Most of us are probably familiar with the idea that most offenses are dealt with by plea, right? When I used to teach, we would say 95% of all cases are dealt with by plea. That is not entirely true when looking at these offenses. So when looking at life max offenses, it's only 80% were, yes, 80% for life maximum offenses are dealt with by plea. So we see a lot more of these offenses going to trial compared to their kind of less serious counterparts. So the impact of this as an independent variable didn't appear to contribute much to sentence length, but they're more pronounced here. So in the full model, if the conviction method was a bench or jury trial, we estimate that the sentence would be 6% longer for a bench trial or 18% longer if the person decided to go to a jury trial compared to a plea. Also worth noting is between the two time periods, so going from judicial guidelines to legislative guidelines, we saw a big change in who decided to go to trial, who decided to take a plea, and what the size of those impacts were also. Looking at offense specific, looking at offense specific, again, right, we see a difference in how much of an impact this has. So while the amount of increase varied by offense, ranging from 12% longer sentences in the regression analyses, not here, for murder sentences, but if the sentence was for assault, we saw sentences increase 20%. So while it explained less than 0.5% of all of the variation, has a substantial impact on what people's sentences actually end up being. Okay. And then all of the things that I just said then can be explained another 13 different ways when we look at the counties. Right? So all of those analyses we did then by each individual county. It was a lot. So, right, essentially the big tagline there is defendants with similar backgrounds, similar offenses, received very different sentences depending on what county they were convicted in. And every single thing that I just discussed about how it varied by offense, it then also varied by county. So how important a prior record variable is in one county versus the next is pretty different. So for example, in Wayne County, prior record explained only 17% of the variance in sentences, while in Muskegon, it explained almost 36% of how long sentences ended up being. So we see very big differences in counties of how they're weighing these things, and then also how they end up impacting sentence length. So, right, obviously I'm not going to do that for another 13 regression analyses because I think you guys want to eat here eventually, but, right, like Barb said, it's all in the report. So the impact of these guidelines or these factors also varied by county. So, for example, PRV in Genesee, a sentence length increased by 23% if it was PRV level A to PRV level B. However, in Kalamazoo, that same increase right, from level A to level B, increase your sentence 57%. So all of these things, right, kind of wash out to be very different sentences depending on what county you are sentenced in. Okay. Conviction method also, right, varied by county. So the idea of adding a jury trial tax added 11% to your sentence in Ingham, 12% in Wayne, and then in other counties, going to trial added 25 to 30% increase in your sentence in Calhoun. Right, so entirely just depending on what county you're in, seeing very different sentence lengths based on these kind of same decisions. Departures also played a really big role, that we saw a lot of different impacts depending on what county. So in Wayne and Genesee, departures explained about 22% of the variance, and then we had other counties that really stuck closely to the sentencing guidelines, such as Oakland, Kalamazoo, Washtenaw, that departures only explain about 5 to 10%. So again, really big disparities depending on what counties you're looking at and what variables. Okay. So the last bit that I will talk about is habitualization. So the use, bless you, of habitual offender enhancements varies significantly by county. Not only how often it is used, but the size of that impact also varies. So essentially, we just have this table of what sentence had the enhancement applied and what didn't. In order to determine habitual eligible, we looked at who was habitualized, what sentence were habitualized, included those, and any sentences that had a prior record score for PRV level 1 or 2. It's worth noting that this is an underestimate, right? Because there are plenty of priors that are not included in your PRV score. So actually, when we looked at this, we had a handful of people who had a PRV level A, right? So they had no priors scored under the guidelines, but they had still been habitualized. So we know that this is an undercount of who's actually eligible to be to have their sentences enhanced with the habitual status. So the percentage of eligible sentences that actually receive enhancements varied from a low of just 13% of eligible sentences in Wayne County to 91.7% of eligible sentences in Muskegon and Saginaw counties. So we see this kind of division of who applies it a lot and who rarely applies it. Generally, kind of what we found is the counties that are using it a lot are not using it as harshly as others. So, for example, Oakland County habitualizes most sentences that are eligible, but they actually have the smallest impact, right? Their sentences for habituals are at the lower end when we look at these counties together. However, the counties that use it rarely, such as Wayne County, when they use it, it really impacts the sentence, right? So they kind of reserve it for the more serious things, and then, right, when they have the ability and decide to use that habitual enhancement, they really, right, give it to it. So we see these kind of big differences in how it is applied, as well as how much of an impact it has. So, like I said, Oakland utilized the enhancement often, but had the smallest increases in sentence lengths, which, right, some of the things that we found through our analyses went against, right, kind of some commonly preconceived notions of Oakland having this, tough on crime, harsh kind of reputation. That's not necessarily, right, always what our analyses have found. So there's a lot more, but I did want to leave at least a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Why that is. We want to have it. It's almost dropped from the structure. And it's a file for fault. And typically the case is a file for whatever reason. Whatever. But it seems to me that that's giving us a prevalent place. It's not being done.
So we did break it down further in the report. So we did look at conviction method, and we did see quite a few people sentences that were pled to and still had the habitual enhancement, but I want to say more than 50% actually. But that is a very big part of it, right? Substantially more of the habitualized sentences were dealt with by jury trial. So that was part of it, but we were surprised by how many sentences were pled and still had that enhancement. Yeah.
So what we told you is how long?
Which would have been a very interesting thing to look at. There's a long list of things that we would love to have more data and examine. Other questions? Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Okay.
does it reflect the actual imposition of sentences enhanced? And I practice a lot in Oakland County. And up until last year, when we got a new elected prosecutor, the policy was if you were eligible for an enhancement, a notice of enhancement was filed, regardless of the age of the priors or anything else, okay? And of course, the whole definition of what qualifies as enhancement in Michigan is so skewed because it does not reflect conviction, sentence, new crime. It can arise out of your first conviction for 7 felonies in one case. Okay, you are now a HAB 8 if you do something else. What I found in Oakland County is, well, the judges would nod their heads and say, yes, okay, you're, as a habitual offender, you're going to be sentenced too. But they would impose the exact same sentence as their not so passive, aggressive way of reacting to the elected prosecutor's policies. So that's my question, is does it really reflect increased sentences under habitual, or is it just the fact that the habitual enhancement was authorized and was part of the case, and maybe a sentence was imposed, but it doesn't reflect an actual increase in sentencing, or does it?
So in Oakland County, which was unique, as you might know.
Yes. Yes, welcome to Oakland County.
Right? So they use it all the time, but we saw the smallest impact of that increase.
Okay.
So everybody was habitualized, but they had the lowest sentences for the lowest increase in sentences because of habitualization. Yes. There is a very wide variety of how this plays out. We tried to kind of come up with a categorization of like who habitualizes a lot and what the impact is, and essentially it's a little bit like throwing spaghetti at a wall. It's all over the place. There's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason, right? All the counties kind of do it their own way.